Hello one and all, this is Soulful Lord James Bullock once again with another video game first impressions. This time around, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, exclusively for the PlayStation 5. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is of course the sequel to Final Fantasy VII Remake, which came out in 2020. It continues the reimagining of the original Final Fantasy VII story that also was accented by Final Fantasy VII Integrate, which introduced Yuffie as not only a playable character but also some mini games that would flow into Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Rebirth of course follows up on obviously Remake's story in terms of the fall of Sector 7 and the Avalanche crew of Cloud, Tifa, Barrett, Aerith, and Red 13 exiting Midgar into the open world of the grasslands and beyond. And that is the biggest difference between Final Fantasy VII Remake and Rebirth, is the fact that you immediately are thrust into a more open environment where you're able to traverse these plains, or to a certain extent ruins, of cities and towns and lands affected by Shinra Corporation and the extracting of Mako from the planet. And with these open world environments, we get this new implementation of markers and activities and intel thanks to Chadley, the returning scientist who was responsible for the VR battles that were some of the toughest battles in Remake. And it's because of his need for more intelligence and understanding of the world that you're able to go throughout these various biomes and do certain activities, including finding a bunch of crystals to scan, discovering a Moogle hideout, fighting particular tougher than normal enemies under certain criteria conditions that must be accomplished to get the full experience from those battles, and even taking part in some of the mini games that we've seen in previous games, including Fort Condor being the root of one intel mission. And of course there are towers, but unlike towers in say Assassin's Creed that open up the cloudy map, these towers actually reveal more activities that the player can accomplish if they want to complete all of the intel of that biome. It is through this intel that you're able to buy materia and certain items from Chadley, and it really mixes up things when it comes to the expectations of the open world environment of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, considering how linear Final Fantasy VII Remake was. There are also side quests and side hustles as they're called, including taking photos of certain scenic areas or wrangling a chocobo that you can race, which also opens up traversal and fast travel for certain areas, like the chocobo stands that you have to restore by literally pulling up a pole off the ground and resetting it, but it adds another fast travel point on the map. From a gameplay perspective, this isn't the turn-based RPG that we've grown to know and love when it comes to Final Fantasy VII the original, but the action RPG-oriented nature of Final Fantasy VII Remake done even better than it was in Integrate. Of course, you can switch between your playable characters, whoever you have in your active party, and pull off regular attacks, build up your ATB meter to cast spells or abilities, or even use items. The limit break system, of course, returns where you take damage and are able to eventually use some grandiose, spectacular, and potentially heavy-handed attacks or defensive measures, especially if you're playing with Aerith, to rattle foes or buff your party. The synergy system that was first presented in Integrate also returns here, as you're able to team up with particular party members and pull off some stunning attacks that may even add some buffs to your characters, like adding an extra bar to your ATB gauge or increasing your limit break gauge so you can use your limit break a lot faster. You can actually call in your inactive party members to save you once your health gets low and your team is almost wiped out, to pull off a devastating attack that may or may not save you from having to redo a battle. Interestingly enough, your inactive party members are visible at all times, including during battles, where, depending on who they are, they may even throw some attacks your way to help pepper enemies so they can maybe go down a little faster. The pressure and stagger gauge that has become synonymous with the Final Fantasy franchise since Final Fantasy XIII still is here, and it works really well, especially if you're able to time certain attacks properly. Say if an enemy is preparing to unleash a devastating, unblockable attack, and you're able to hit their elemental weakness with a spell before they are able to unleash that attack, it will pressure them and stun them, and leave them open to increase their stagger meter, which of course once that is full they are stunned and left open to be attacked ferociously, which at times could be the perfect opportunity to pull off a limit break or even activate a summon. Now just like Final Fantasy VII Remake, summons aren't able to be called in as the player sees fit, as the meter that fills to prepare a summon to be activated is somewhat randomized, but I have noticed that it happens a lot more frequently, especially if you're able to pressure or stagger an enemy, than it was in Final Fantasy VII Remake, giving you more opportunities to unleash those powerful summons. And once the summon is on the battlefield, you can use your ATB meter to actually send out specific commands and special attacks. Of course, the guarding and parry system returns, where if you're able to hit the block button at the perfect time right before you hit, you can parry, and at times if you can dodge roll, you can actually parry and cause a pressure attack. Now there are still some issues when it comes to the combat. Enemies can hit you a lot faster and a lot harder and even break your combos, while you can't stop the animation for a combo, which will cause you to get damaged, which was a problem in the previous game. And that also flows into utilizing magic, where sometimes you could cast a spell and the enemy just so happens to hit you right before you're finished casting the spell, and that resets the spell, but you still lose the MP that you were going to use if that spell had been cast. There are certain elemental magics like Blizzard, for example, that are stationary. So if the enemy doesn't stay still and they zip across the screen right when you cast that magic spell, it won't follow the enemy, it won't home the enemy. And that causes, of course, a loss of MP and a magic attack that may be very detrimental to your success in that battle. While locking on does work pretty well, flying enemies can be a bit of a bother, especially if you're playing with Cloud or Red 13 or Tifa, where there is no jump button, so the player is reliant on the game hopefully trying to propel your character into the air to hit those flying enemies. If you don't have someone like Barret or Aerith to utilize long-range attacks, that may or may not be as effective as you would want them to be during the situation. The initial camera settings also are very intrusive and don't help when it comes to battles, as it needs to be pulled back a little bit further, and thankfully you can utilize the settings to move the camera back and forth, but it still feels like it could be a little bit further back to give you more of a viewpoint of the battlefield and anticipation of certain attacks that you cannot see coming your way off screen. From a narrative perspective thus far, a majority of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth follows in line with what was seen in the original game, though there are some interesting choices in terms of utilizing certain characters at certain particular points, including Yuffie, who shows up in Junon, which makes no sense considering how late in the first disc, essentially, of the first game that she shows up. But it also makes sense in line with what happened in Intergrade, where she was in Midgar during the time when the main cast was also in Midgar. Sephiroth makes a few appearances here and there, including an extensive background, the Calm section, where players would go to Calm and have a backstory in terms of Cloud's connection with Sephiroth while he was a part of Soldier. And that plays out in almost full here, pretty much one-to-one, with some interesting takes here and there that really emphasizes just how destructive Sephiroth became during the last days of him as a sane Soldier member. But the big thing about this game thus far is the mini-games, the amount of stuff that you can do, as noted, when it comes to the Intel and Chadley. But also Fort Condor returns, and most importantly, Queen's Blood, which is a card game that they have apparently put a lot of time and effort into to make incredibly interesting and addictive. It's also very challenging, especially when you get to Junon, and maybe your card deck isn't as strong as you would have hoped it to be, because unlike Final Fantasy VIII, for example, there aren't as many random people just raiding around to be challenged to a card game as you would have hoped, with only designated characters being available. I really wish it would have been a little bit more open in terms of potentially facing NPCs that are ready to do battle with Queen's Blood. Technically the game is gorgeous, of course. There are a few performance hiccups when it comes to not only performance mode but also graphics mode in regards to frame rate drops. But the biggest issue that I've noticed thus far is the sound mixing. There will be times when the music overwhelms the vocal presentation. While the game automatically sets everything to have subtitles, it becomes imperative that you do, because if you don't, you will miss out on information or just character banter because of how loud the music can be at times. And you don't want to turn off the music completely, because the soundtrack, of course, is phenomenal. But it's something that hopefully will be fixed in the near future, where the music doesn't overwhelm the vocal presentation. I've also had a few graphical glitches here and there when it comes to enemies getting stuck or random broken objects just floating away in weird fashion. But beyond that, it's still a stellar experience, and overall, it is exactly what I would have wanted from Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. As a big fan of the franchise and a big fan of Final Fantasy VII, this is a monumental experience thus far in just a few hours that I've played, the 20 or so hours that I've already put into the game. It is a monumental experience and definitely well worth a playthrough if you are a fan of Final Fantasy VII Remake. If you enjoyed that, you will definitely enjoy this. And if you didn't play Final Fantasy VII Remake, get the package, the total package of Remake, Intergrade, and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth to experience everything thus far. This is a full-fledged, solid recommendation, and something that I may have as my game of the year before it's all said and done. So there you have it. This has been Soulful Lordy, James Bullock, once again with another video game first impressions. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, exclusively for the PlayStation 5. And if you don't mind, I see a new challenger for my crown of the Queen's Blood King, and anyone that decides to step up and try to challenge my card deck will have no choice but to say, "Oh Lordy!"